Welcome back, Richard. It's good to see you this morning.
Good to be here. Thanks.
And here we are. We're starting the second week of August, and here in our district, school starts tomorrow. And but I was in Atlanta last week, and school had already started there. So so school's starting everywhere within the next month or so, and so it's always just cause for us to talk about teenagers a little bit.
Right. And here in what used to be our quiet little town, we notice when schools are in session again because traffic kind of doubles or triples. Yes. So we have to leave a little earlier and watch out for school buses. You know, they're putting cameras on school buses this year to catch drivers who drive by stopped school buses. So a new thing in Florida this year. So be on the alert. Stop buses.
Absolutely. So today we're going to extend a conversation that we had a few weeks ago. We talked about Jonathan Haidt's book on, today's teenagers. And we spent a lot of time talking about his perspective, which we agree with a lot of the things that he said. But as those of you who often listen to our podcast, you might recall us having a bit of an issue with his tendency towards using the word cause, saying that technology is causing a lot of the distress and all that adolescents and kids are experiencing these days. And we have a little bit of a problem with that. But otherwise, he brings up some really important and good points and in his book, and we thought that was worth talking about before. We're going to expand that a little bit today.
Right. Yeah, it's too bad that they push this technology. Social media is causing the rise in depression, anxiety, and suicide in children. There's a correlation, but there is a lot in this book that's really good. I mean, he makes some really, really valid points, and so I think the rest of the book makes a good contribution. But he did talk about cell phones and social media as the cause of teenage anxiety. We know teenage rates of mental illness in teenagers are rising. And he said, well, they're rising because of cell phones and social media. The statistics are sobering. I mean, 1 in 3 adolescents between the ages of 13 and 18 experience anxiety. Those are very high numbers. 1 out of 3 are struggling. And that increase began in around 2007, which is about the time that the smartphone and social media appeared. So between 2007, 2012, there was this 20% increase in mental illness in teenagers and almost double that for suicide rates for the same period.
Right.
So we know there's some relationship between these two things. We're not sure exactly what it is. But in this article, this guy says, wait a minute, let's slow down a little bit. And I think that's the important contribution. And he's saying, yeah, there's some relationship, but let's slow down and make a more careful analysis of this relationship.
Absolutely.
This article is called Every Generation, and just not to create a spoiler here, but every generation is the anxious generation.
Right.
Okay. The problem that teenagers face today is maybe made worse by cell phones, but it's not caused by cell phones because every generation has had its struggles. And that's what I like about this article is it takes a little broader, a little more thoughtful view of the relationship between phones, social media, and the increases in anxiety and depression in teenagers.
Absolutely. And the link to that article is in the show notes. It's published in Slate by Alex Zelnick. I think that's how you pronounce his name. But he talks about what I really like about this article is he begins by saying, look, this is, generally speaking, this is a pretty good time for teenagers. This is they do have access to any information, anything that they want or need. Their life expectancy is up. Health outcomes are up. Education, there's more access to education. And at the same time, some of the negative things that we think about are decreasing. Drug use is down, crime is down, and things like that. And so, while this is sort of a time of prosperity, it is a little bit baffling as to why there's so much anxiety happening in teenagers during this time when things are relatively good. They have access to things, and things seem to be pretty good for kids. And it goes along with a lot of things that parents ask us. Parents will come in and say, well, what does he have to be anxious about? What does he have to be stressed about? And I think that Zelnick does a pretty decent job of talking about some of those things.
Right. I was surprised when I read that because, we tend to think that the sky is falling or that, we have these serious problems. And he refers to this as a time of prosperity. Things are actually much better. I mean, if you take an objective look, things are going much better even for teenagers. So why the increase? And so that's what we're going to walk through is why in this time of prosperity and access, why are the rates of mental illness going up? And he offers several explanations, and I think they're worth considering. And the latest, the first one is the latest, and I love this stuff because I've lived through most of these, the latest innovation problem.
Right. Yeah. and this is, and it goes along with saying with the title of the article that every generation is the anxious generation. It absolutely is the case. And I remember this psychiatrist that I first worked with, Dr. Archie Silver. We were talking about him before we started recording. And he brought this up. He would talk about this at times that there's always something that people think is going to be the next the cause of the next coming of Jesus. It's going to be like, this is the thing that's going to bring about the apocalypse. And it was railways, because oh my gosh, you mean you can get from one side of the country to the other side of the country in like 2 days? Wow. That's so fast. And then it was radio, and it's like, okay, people are just going to spend all their time sitting and listening to radio. They did the same thing for TV, right?
Right.
And it's like every time there's a big innovation, whether it's railroads, cars, radios, TVs, whenever there's some new innovation, the older generation always says, okay, this is surely going to be the demise of the younger generation, because that's all they're going to be focused on.
One of the places where this is really apparent is with music. When you go back and think about music and you think about Elvis Presley and whether he's going to be the ruin. I mean, there were people arrested, for what he was arrested in Florida, I think. You have Elvis Presley, and that was going to ruin the generation. And then the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were going to ruin the generation. And then it's rap music, and then it's hip hop, and then there's always something that the previous generation uses to explain the demise of teenagers. This is going to be the ruination of teenagers. This is why teenagers act the way they do, because of the speed of the railroad or the radios or cars or some other problem. So every generation has this technology problem, and this is this generation's technology problem. But let's be careful about attributing any more to this than we did to railroad speed. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Dr. Silver would often say, and I remember he talked about this after Columbine in was it 1999. And he said video game, because everybody was saying video games and music and stuff was the cause of that, for why those students did that at the school. And he said, if that was the case, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, all the teenagers would have been, robbing trains and robbing banks, because that's what all the TV show, that's what everything was about, bank robberies and train robberies and things like that. And people didn't do that. And so if video games and TV and media has that kind of influence, why wasn't there that huge increase back then? So we need to kind of back off of that just a little bit.
Right.
But
So number one, keep in mind the technology problem. Number two is a little more difficult. It's called we are hardwired for dissatisfaction.
I think
And
it's important though. I think it's a really important one.
it is because there's an evolutionary advantage to dissatisfaction because you would use it to avoid danger and to seek reward. You'd be watching other people,
Mhm.
and you have this sort of uneasiness of there should be more, or I should be doing more, or I should be feeling better, or I should. So there's this internal sense of dissatisfaction. And when you're living in a tribal culture, there's an evolutionary advantage because it helps as you're watching others, well, somebody ate this mushroom and died. Okay, so there's an advantage to observing that sort of thing, and also to seek reward. So keep in mind as we talk about this, because we're going to come back to this notion of what role dissatisfaction plays in teenagers.
Right. Well, and I think that, and the way that I thought about this one, because the next one is a little bit is very
It's related.
related.
Right.
It is,
Mhm.
but the way that I thought about this one is, this is what evolution is. Evolution is, you know what, things don't feel quite right.
Mhm.
I'm not quite, I think that things could be better. And so
Right.
I'm going to strike out and I'm going to look for a better place for us
Mhm.
to live. I'm going to look for a better place for us to be able to hunt. I'm going to
Right.
look for a better way for us to do these things. And that kind of thought process is born out of dissatisfaction. It
Exactly. Right.
you have to want something to be better, in order for you to find a better way to do it. If everybody is perfectly content with the way things are, well, you're going to stay exactly where you are. You're not going to improve. And so, so yeah, I agree with him that we are wired for dissatisfaction, some more so than others,
Right.
and create
Right.
problems. But
Yeah.
I think that for the most part, we are hardwired for dissatisfaction.
Right. And the reason we are is because for most of human history, I mean, I don't care how far you go back, 2,000 years, 5,000 years, 10,000 years, we were facing two things. One was there were threats everywhere. Everything was trying to eat us or kill us. And we were the weakest member on the field. Everybody else was bigger, stronger, faster. Um, so there were threats everywhere. And there was also deprivation regularly. I mean, we didn't have agriculture. We didn't have fields of wheat and grains. We had to go out and forage and find stuff. There was always deprivation. So it was advantageous to be vigilant because you had to be ready for danger. And it was also advantageous to feel dissatisfied because that's what managed you. You knew deprivation was coming. So you had this nagging feeling of dissatisfaction, which helped you to deal with the inevitable deprivation that we were facing during most of our history. Now, the fourth reason, and this gets us closer to today's teenagers, is that for almost all of human history, and we're talking up to about maybe 150 or 200 years ago, identity and your place in society was ascribed to you at birth.
Right.
If,
Well,
300,
Well, I think no, I think that those issues have been present for thousands of years. Because if you think
exactly.
about, the Egyptian pharaohs, I mean, that
Mhm.
was those people were identified at birth as to who they were. You look at in India, the caste system and things like that. Those things were ascribed based upon who your parents were and then who their parents were. And
Mhm.
and you're right. It's that what really brings it home now is that everybody is looking for that social position. They're looking for that identity. And if you think about it being fixed, like, okay, your identity and everything is set at birth, that can bring about a great deal of challenges and challenging emotions for people, because most of us don't want to stay in the position that we are from childhood.
But that's relatively recent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because for most of our history, if your father was a blacksmith, you were probably going to be a blacksmith. If
Right.
you were living on a farm, you were going to be a farmer.
Right.
If your dad was the prince, you were going to be a prince. Okay. So it was ascribed at birth. But since World War II, and
Hmm.
so now we're getting into the baby boomer generation, but certainly for millennials, and millennials are sort of the end of that boom, like 1980s and onward. So I think it started with the end of World War II with baby boom generation, but certainly it was in full swing by 1981. Teenagers in prosperous countries, and this is for the first time in human history, were able to be they were able to be involved in the process of becoming more than the previous generation.
Yeah.
And that's really relatively new.
Right.
Not relatively new. It is absolutely new.
Right.
Prior to this time, and only in prosperous countries, because in most cultures today, you're going to do what your parents did.
You don't have a
Okay.
choice.
You don't have a choice. When you
Right.
talk about India, China, it's very hard. Upward mobility is very difficult in most cultures. But in prosperous countries, especially Western European, North American cultures, teenagers now are fully engaged in becoming more.
Yeah.
Now, but and this is the important point here, and you're going to love this. I can tell you right now, you're all going to love what's about to happen. Today's teenagers are struggling with more than identity. We began to struggle as a baby boomer. I struggled with my identity because I was allowed to become more than my father.
Hmm.
Okay. And I struggled with, then what do I want to be? Who do I want to become? What life do I want? And that was relatively new. As part of the baby boom generation, I was the first one, my generation was the first one to say, we can become whatever we want. You can become anything, which is good, but it creates something called ennui. Now, the other guy in this podcast knows a smidge more about movies than I do. So he's going to take you through this journey of ennui.
Well, and it's really being introduced. Obviously the idea of ennui has been around for a long time, but it is now going to be very much more popular because of the movie Inside Out 2. For those of you who haven't seen the first Inside Out movie, we a number of years ago, really, we did a podcast or a couple of podcasts on the movie Inside Out because it is fantastic. And it is very well done as it relates to what's going on inside a person as they are experiencing different emotions and different things in life. Well, Inside Out 2 is this transition to adolescence. And so all these new emotions are introduced. And yes, one of those is ennui. And it's a fantastic character. But in as depicted in the movie, Ennui suffers from like existential boredom and dissatisfaction and could not care less about what's going on or what's happening. They constantly have the character just laying back on the couch, playing on her phone, and just completely detached. Doesn't have the energy to get up and move over to the station board and just completely disinterested in all of these things. And but it is an amazingly accurate depiction of so many aspects of teenagers. It's not depression per se. It's not
No,
that they are sad. It's just that they are dissatisfied and bored, and it's like a combination of all of these things.
that's right. This is where dissatisfaction comes in. When we talk about dissatisfaction, which is an evolutionary advantage, what what today's teenagers are experiencing is this sort of dissatisfaction, sort of this inherited sense of dissatisfaction. But he makes the point that ennui, and I think that's an absolutely perfect word. And I'm so glad that they created this character because now we'll all have a visual. We'll all share the same image of ennui because even the color, isn't she gray in the movie? I haven't seen the
Yeah.
movie. She's gray, right? Which
Yeah.
is a perfect color, right? Just blah, you know. And she just doesn't have the energy to even get up. But it's not depression. And I think that's the important point that he's making. This isn't depression. And it's really not just boredom. Boredom is a little bit different. This is a feeling of existential weariness and dissatisfaction. It's sort of we use the term malaise, this sort of feeling that it's just not worth doing. Okay. And it's a manifestation, it's an expression of a loss of purpose or meaning in your life. And I think that's what today's teenagers are
Mhm.
struggling with. It's not their problem, it's their struggle. They're struggling with this. They don't have a purpose. They don't know what they want to do. They don't have obligations, and they're trying to figure out who they are. And they get this vague sense, and the word that captures it is ennui. And now we
Yeah.
have this wonderful character.
And what the author of this article talks about, and I think that, again, I think that this is great, and it reminds me of the other podcast that we did on, the problem with telling your kids that they can be anything that they want, right?
Right.
Be anything that you want to be, because it simply just isn't true. Um, but what we're dealing with this is that we live in that society of, as he said, it's a very prosperous time.
Right.
Um, but it's a problem of having too much and too many. You can, again, we have access to any information just about that we want. You are, we live in a society now where, again, compared to especially a couple hundred years ago, even, we can pick any religion that you want to pick. You can choose whether you're going to have children or not. You can choose where you want to live, what you want to buy, what you want to do with your hair. You can choose what clothes you wear. You have all of these choices that you can make.
Mhm.
And as the author says, sometimes an environment of plenty can be just as anxiety producing as an environment of scarcity.
Well, and I want to hammer that point and keep hammering at it, because this is the problem of too much and too many.
Mhm.
Okay. And it is as much of a problem as deprivation.
Right.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
You think of the pilgrims, you think of the early colonists, or you think of the early people who settled the West and far West in our country. They didn't pick their religion. This is your religion, period. You were too busy foraging for food to worry about
Right.
what religion you were going to be or where you were going to. Today, we're our teenagers today pick whatever religion they want, whether you're going to have children or not, where you're going to live, what you're going to buy, especially what you're going to buy. All of these things now, what do you want your hair to look like? There are all these decisions that now we can make. And
Mhm.
that creates so much activity in your head that some people just shut down.
Right.
And when you shut down, we call it ennui.
Right. And so there's this relationship, and if we bring it back to cell phones and screens and things like that, this relationship between screens and anxiety and this ennui, this distress. There was a Harvard study that showed that we're least happy when our minds are wandering, when we are sort of left to think about whatever we want to think about. And you can, imagine being on their phone and just not having anything in particular that you want to look at. You're just kind of scrolling through and just looking at things. We are least happy in those situations, especially compared to times, when we seem to be most happy, when we are very focused on a specific activity that engages us. And
Mhm.
I think that that's what you were saying with, in history, we didn't think about, we didn't have to sit around and wonder what religion that we were going to study or where we were going to live or anything like that. Our focus was on, I got to get food for today, or I have to make sure that we are safe today. And it's a very focused activity,
Right.
and that brings much more life satisfaction. And that life satisfaction is a little bit different than the dissatisfaction we were talking about before, that helps us to expand and explore.
Mhm.
But it just makes it sort of frees up more brain space to do some of these other things than when we have nothing specific to focus on.
Yeah, there's a word here. I'm sure you know what it is. There's if you think of you pick up a cell phone and people tell me, because I'm new at this cell phone stuff. My kids tell me, well, Dad, just Google it and it'll show you how to do it.
Hmm.
Okay.
Right.
Change an oil filter or make a smoothie or whatever you want to do.
Right.
I understand that there's a YouTube video. It's not Google. It's a YouTube video
Right.
to explain it. I stop smiling.
It's okay.
And so there's a YouTube video. If you go to a YouTube video to figure out how to do something, that's what we're talking about with focus on an activity. You're completely focused on accomplishing something and you feel good about accomplishing it. Now, the word I'm looking for, Bernie, is it called dead scrolling, where you're just sort of lying in your bed,
Yeah, something like that.
scrolling through your phone, purposeless? You
Hmm.
know, it's kind of interesting, but it's really not it. You're not looking for anything in particular. You're just kind of sort of scrolling through stuff. In TV, I did an article back in the 80s about TV, and we watched the least objectionable program.
Right.
Right? It's not that you wanted to see this program; it's just what you were
Well,
willing to put because there was nothing else on, so I watched that.
it's a difference between watching a program, a television program, and watching TV.
That's
Because when
right,
you're watching TV, you're just surfing.
and it's exactly that's exactly what you're doing, and you watch the least objectionable thing that happens. You don't really want to watch the Lawrence Welk show, but it's better than the
Mhm.
World Wrestling Federation or something, and so you watch what you're not interested in. Same with phones, okay, and I think it's called dead scrolling is when
I
you
think so. Yeah.
yeah when you scroll through your phone, and that's the problem. But there's so much. The
Mhm.
culture that our teens are living in is there's so much that it becomes overwhelming. And when you think about how much stuff is pouring into a cell phone, I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that had to get some furniture for something. And boy, once you enter the world of buying, whether it's Amazon or Etsy or Facebook, man, you just get flooded with. I had no idea how many different kinds of sheets there are in the world, because you don't think about it. My God, there are pages and pages and pages of anything you want.
Right.
And to a teenager who's trying to make all these decisions, it just is overwhelming. And the overwhelming comes in the form of ennui, not depression, not it's not a true mental illness.
Right.
It is a condition, but it's not a true mental illness. And the word ennui, I think, is a great name for what teenagers are going through.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so they get overstimulated with the time that they spend on their screen, and then it leads to this boredom, ennui,
They-
lethargic, and sometimes even irritable, uh,
right. Because you
especially when
just get
they're not,
overwhelmed. Yeah,
right,
it's just
especially when they're not
overwhelming.
stimulated.
Right.
So as we pull all this together, we have to remember that for most of human existence.
Mhm.
Life has been difficult. Life has
Right.
been
Mhm.
challenging, and
Right.
in the form of some forms of dissatisfaction, it does help us prosper. It helps us push forward and explore and do those kinds of things, and that is not in any way abnormal.
No.
We don't have to pathologize a feeling of dissatisfaction. We can
Right.
instead, let's figure out what we're dissatisfied about and find create a pursuit of resolving that issue.
Mhm.
Um, but when it comes to what's happening with teens is that they're not doing that next step. They're not doing the next step of, okay, I'm dissatisfied, I'm experiencing this ennui.
Mhm.
I acknowledge it. Now, what do I do? What do I do to resolve that? What can I do to manage this dissatisfaction? And how do I fix that problem? And I don't think that we're doing a very good job of equipping teenagers with the tools that they need to solve those problems. Instead, what we're doing is we are hurrying and pushing them through school as fast as they can go, and
Right.
we're forgetting about the learning process. It's just a completion process. If you can complete everything and check off these check boxes, then you can graduate, then you can go on to the next thing.
Right.
But there's no satisfaction in that. You're not learning, you're
Right.
just doing. And that contributes, I think, to this whole problem.
That's right. It's more and more and more. It's
Right.
always chase, chase, chase. So this notion of teenage dissatisfaction, what we call teenage angst or teenage angst, however you want to pronounce it, didn't just appear for the first time in 2007. This has been with us for a long time. So it's not caused by smartphones or social media, but, and I think it's worth saying that the cell phones and the social media are part of the too much and too many culture. Is that we're throwing this tsunami at today's teenagers. It's just overwhelming. And when you get overwhelmed, many people shut down. So it creates a kind of depression, sort of depression in shutter quotes, and it's in the form of ennui. But we create a social media and shopping, Amazoning, as one woman wrote, turned it into a verb. I'm Amazoning today. It creates a dissatisfaction that can't. It's almost impossible to satisfy it because there's just too much going on. And I think that's closer to what I think teenagers are experiencing today. Not a mental illness, but this dissatisfaction, the ennui, the malaise of just being overwhelmed by how much there is to do, how much there is to know about.
Absolutely. And what we need to talk about, I'm sure we'll talk about this more because it brings up so many other things to think about, like the fact that, you know, school has become so much of a challenge for a lot of kids. And you know, what they will say is, well, if I wanted to know about that, I could just look it up on, you know, I could Google it, or I could, you know, look it up on YouTube, and I would know how to do that, or I would know that, you know, in right away. You know, I wouldn't have to spend a whole day at school. But of course, like, how would you know that you should know that unless you were at school to try to say, hey, you should know how to do this. So
Right.
it's like there's this real, almost, it's a cognitive dissonance of between, you know, what's really happening and what should be happening, and the way that teenagers want it to be and kids want it to be. And it is creating this this emotion of ennui in a lot of people. So, but I'm sure that we'll be talking about this more in the future.
Right.
So,
Yep.
all right. Well, we hope that everyone has a great first week of school. And if you aren't starting this week, whenever it is that you start, we hope that it's a great week. And so until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.